Welcome everyone to the very first episode on the Octagon Labs YouTube channel. My name is Shlok. I'm a hardcore MMA and UFC fan. I became a UFC fan during COVID times and Charles Oliveira's title run. I found the sport extremely captivating, and I've also always been deep into the sports betting side as well. So today I'm going to break down all my picks and predictions for the UFC 329 fight card where Conor McGregor is making his return against Max Holloway. I'm not only going to do picks and predictions on this channel, I'm going to be doing a lot of different things. So, stay tuned for all of that. I'm sure everyone here is new since this is the very first video on this brand new channel. So I'm excited about everything. So without further ado, let's jump right into the picks and predictions for every fight on the UFC 329 fight card. All right, so I'm going to kick things off with a Conor McGregor versus Max Holloway fight because I think that's what people really care about. I'm sure some of you guys are hardcores as well, want to talk about Zachary Reese versus Ryan Gandra, but let's just kick things off with the main event, what we're all here for, the return of the Mac, the return of Conor McGregor. And, I think a lot of us have the very, same questions when it comes to this fight. Is Conor locked in? Where is he at? He looked washed kind of against Poirier. Is he going to be even more washed now? We got 5 rounds at 170. His cardio was never good before. What will it be today? And, honestly, I'm pretty torn on this fight. I do think it actually is interesting. I think Conor probably has a little bit more of a chance than a lot of people are giving him credit for. And you can kind of see that in the betting line as well. I mean, Max Holloway was in the minus 400s when he opened, but now, this is closing in. Max Holloway is a 2-1 favorite. And, the logical pick here is going to be Max Holloway. And honestly, I'm going to do it. I'm going to pick Conor McGregor because while the logical pick is Max Holloway, let's just kind of take a look at the way this fight's going to play out, right? Conor's going to be super live early. Conor's power is something that hasn't left him. Power is the last thing that leaves you. Yes, he's older. Yes, his cardio is going to be a problem. But at the same time, Max Holloway, Conor McGregor was a featherweight early in his career. Max Holloway was a featherweight as late as just last year or 2 years ago when he fought Ilia Topuria, and he did get knocked out in that fight. He got wobbled by Dustin Poirier. That chin of Max Holloway's is there for the taking. Ilia took it. He finally, knocked him out. And then on top of that, Conor is someone that definitely can knock anyone out. So the first 2 rounds of this fight, I think, are going to be really, really important. In those 2 rounds, Conor is going to be extremely dangerous. And, 10 minutes with Conor McGregor, it's something really interesting for me to see on someone like Max Holloway. Max Holloway is not like Dustin Poirier. And the thing is, Max Holloway doesn't have the power, the leg kicks of a Dustin Poirier. So Dustin Poirier did pose a lot of different problems for Conor McGregor when he did return, his last time around. And that was years ago. So a couple factors at play here. Obviously, I don't love the layoff. Obviously, there's so many unknowns with the McGregor. But there is one thing I'll say, right? Someone like McGregor, who has all the money in the world, has achieved everything in the sport. And, honestly, we know McGregor is not coming back to become like a double, triple champ or something like that. We don't think McGregor is at that level anymore at this point in his career. So why is McGregor back? I don't think McGregor is coming back just for a payday or, just to take a fight to get some more attention. I think he already has all those things. So he's coming back in a fight that I truly think he honestly believes he can win. It's also the year of the underdog. We saw Hamza lose. We saw Ilia Topuria lose. That one really hurt me. I'm a big Ilia Topuria fan. And, now we have Conor McGregor going up against Max Holloway. Why can't Conor win? Obviously, if this fight drags on, I'm going to be worried for Conor. But at the same time, 10 minutes with a locked-in, focused Conor at a weight class that Max has never fought at, after all the damage he's taken, where his chin is today, without that same leg kick threat, without a power threat coming back Conor's way, without a wrestling threat coming back Conor's way. I mean, Conor has lost, Poirier when he was kind of peaking, and then Khabib. So I think Conor is super live here. I think, it's closer than people think. Obviously, like I said, if this fight does end up extending, there's going to be problems for Conor McGregor. That's not a cardio that I have any faith in. But at the same time, in those first 5 to 10 minutes, can Conor pull something off? 100%. And also, I mean, it's Conor McGregor. I wouldn't be surprised if, at the end of this fight, we're calling an early stoppage here and there. If Conor gets him hurt and, ref jumps in to kind of give Conor that KO, I wouldn't be surprised if that's what we're talking about. So the UFC is in need of stars. Feels a little bit coded for Conor McGregor to come and pull this one off. I'm going to go ahead and pick Conor McGregor. Maybe it's a casual pick. Maybe it's not a first, good look, a good first impression for this channel. But I think Conor can do it, man. I think maybe I'm dreaming, but I got Conor McGregor by early knockout on Max Holloway. Let's move on to the next matchup. All right, moving on to the next matchup. Our co-main event is Benoit Saint Denis versus Paddy Pimblett. This is a great fight in the lightweight division. Does have some level of title implications for sure. Benoit Saint Denis on a 4-fight win streak after his loss to, was it Renato Moicano, I believe, and then prior to that, he lost to Dustin Poirier. So, BSD lost a bit of steam. Then he won 4 fights in a row. But I'm not going to lie to you. I'm not sold on BSD. The 4-fight win streak he has, I think, is fairly fraudulent. I think Paddy Pimblett does go and win this fight. Now, obviously, that Paddy Pimblett loss to Justin Gaethje looks a lot better today than it did prior to the White House card. I'm kind of pissed off at Ilya. I'm not going to lie. He makes Justin Gaethje look like a world beater, which I know Justin Gaethje is good, and I know Justin Gaethje is fairly underrated. He was a 2-1 dog against Paddy Pimblett. He was a big dog against Ilia Topuria. He goes out there and beats both of those guys. But honestly, Justin Gaethje is not that guy in my opinion. But at the same time, neither is Benoit Saint-Denis. So I think that Justin Gaethje loss that Paddy Pimblett has to kind of wrap that part up is, not as terrible as we once thought. We thought Justin Gaethje wasn't, we knew he was an elite lightweight, but we didn't think he was, the top echelon, the Charles Oliveira, Arman Sarukian, Islam Makhachev, Ilia Topuria. We didn't think Justin Gaethje belonged in that conversation, but honestly, clearly he does. Paddy Pimblett's loss to him, Paddy Pimblett did fairly well. He picked up that third round purely on the feet against Gaethje. Paddy Pimblett's chin is, really fucking good. He's not going to get knocked out. And Benoit Saint-Denis is a berserker. And we saw what one round of top control Renato Moicano kind of did to Benoit Saint-Denis. The amount of damage he did, it was a fucking 10-7 round, in my opinion. So Renato Moicano goes out there and does that to you in one round on top. Paddy Pimblett, do not let Paddy Pimblett get you on the ground because Paddy Pimblett will fucking choke you out. Now, go and look at the 4-fight win streak of Benoit Saint-Denis. I have it pulled up here. We have, Kyle Prepolek. We don't give a shit about that. Mauricio Hufi, obviously, that's an amazing win, but Mauricio Hufi had some real holes in his ground game, and Benoit Saint-Denis was able to kind of exploit that. Paddy Pimblett is not going to have holes in his ground game. Paddy Pimblett obviously probably doesn't have the best pure wrestling and takedowns, but on the ground, he's going to be the better fighter than Benoit Saint-Denis in this matchup. Beneil Dariush, look, Beneil Dariush's chin is probably one of the worst in the entire roster. Like, I think it's just insane. He kind of just dropped to the very first shot he took, was absolutely out of there. And then Dan Hooker, I picked Dan Hooker to beat Benoit Saint-Denis. I think 2 out of 3 judges gave that first round to Dan Hooker. Dan Hooker was fighting a great fight, but once again, Dan Hooker has insanely low fight IQ, ends up, getting taken down and just gets fucked up. So, Benoit Saint-Denis has some decent wins, but all these fighters, I'm seeing like they either have made a fight IQ mistake, have a, serious hole in their game versus Paddy Pimblett. His chin's going to be strong. Benoit Saint-Denis is a berserker. He's going to close the distance. So Pimblett's, shitty takedowns aren't going to matter as much because this fight's going to be in close range and, it's going to get sloppy. This fight will end up on the ground. It's not like Benoit Saint-Denis is going to be, extremely clean where Paddy Pimblett needs a perfect entry to get him down. No, I think if this fight, wants to get to the ground, Paddy Pimblett will be able to figure it out in all the slop, in all the mess. So, I don't think that's a real concern. I think Paddy Pimblett's better on the ground. He has a better chin. We're seeing some BSD staph infection rumors as well. I wouldn't play too much into that. At the end of the day, I'm going to assume BSD is coming in here completely ready. But, like I said, I'm not completely sold. I think Paddy Pimblett wins this one at plus money. Give me the underdog. Give me the Scouser. Paddy Pimblett to win by, I say, second round submission. Let's move on to the next matchup. All right, so moving on up the card, we have Cory Sandhagen versus Mario Bautista. And this is one of the tougher fights to predict, in my opinion. But at the same time, the more I look into it, the more I think, this breakdown is actually fairly linear for this Cory Sandhagen matchup. Now, tricky matchup, Mario Bautista obviously surging. He has losses recently, but losses to people that we expect him to lose to. Losses to people like Umar Nurmagomedov, who also 50-45 Cory Sandhagen. So I wouldn't take that too much into consideration here. But overall, I see Mario Bautista's record, 17-3. He's got some great wins. The Vinicius Oliveira one. Obviously, Vinicius Oliveira probably a little bit overhyped, and it's a fun style. I get it. Oliveira's knocking people out left and right. He's a bit of a dog, a bit of a bully, so people like that. People kind of roll with that. They want that style to be kind of really effective. So I think Oliveira was blown a little bit out of proportion as to how good he was. The Patchy Mix win aged like nothing because everyone apparently beats Patchy Mix. Obviously, the Jose Aldo win. Close split decision. And honestly, I think based on the MMA scoring criteria, you give that one to Aldo. But I don't hate it as a Mario Bautista win. Ricky Simon win. Looks pretty good in my opinion. Damon Blackshear win. Close fight. Shaky one. I had a big bet on Mario Bautista back in 2023 against Damon Blackshear. And, I thought that was a shaky one. He ends up getting a unanimous decision win there. So, Bautista, he's gritty. And contrary to what people believe, he's absolutely not a boring fighter. He's actually the exact opposite. He gets into wars. Go watch his fight with Ricky Simon. One of the best fights I've seen. And, obviously the Jose Aldo performance, people can kind of get hung up on that. But at the same time, that's not normally his fighting style. But what that does tell you, especially from a betting perspective, is that Bautista will do what it takes to win. Bautista understands how to manage rounds. He understands scoring criteria. He understands how things work, and he's going to do what he needs to do to go out there and get the win. Now, Cory Sandhagen, on the other hand, is an extremely skilled fighter in his own right. Cory Sandhagen is coming off a loss to Merab Dvalishvili in a title shot. Merab, obviously one of the best bantamweights of all time. And now, going up against Mario Bautista here, I'm going to have to go ahead and pick Cory Sandhagen to get it done. I think a lot of people this weekend are going to be chasing plus money on Mario Bautista, and it makes sense. Mario Bautista has not lost for so long to, someone that he's supposed to beat. And, even in a close fight in general, Mario Bautista hasn't lost. So that Umar loss, I mean, I'm looking at it, he was plus 500, so 5-1 underdog. I mean, Umar Nurmagomedov obviously is kind of held as, the very upper echelon of this division, someone who can beat a Merab Dvalishvili, can beat a Peter Yan on any given day, had a razor-thin fight with Merab, which honestly, if you go break down scoring criteria there too, there's an argument where, Umar wins 1, 2, and 3. So Umar Nurmagomedov obviously is on a level just above these guys like Mario Bautista and even Cory Sandhagen. Obviously, we saw how he matched up against Cory as well, but Bautista can crack. Bautista is really tough. Bautista, normally wins when he's supposed to, and you're going to see a lot of people chasing plus money on Mario Bautista this weekend. I just think it's the wrong side. I think Cory Sandhagen is going to get it done. I mean, Cory Sandhagen obviously losses to Merab recently, losses to Umar. Umar never controlled him, but, that grappling really throws off his rhythm, and I just don't think that, Mario Bautista has the grappling threat of a Merab Dvalishvili, of a Umar Nurmagomedov. I don't think it's similar. So, at range, Cory Sandhagen is insanely hard to hit. Cory Sandhagen is just, insanely slick, and he's really good with closing the void, staying out of range. Mario Bautista is going to have to wrestle a lot in order to kind of break Cory Sandhagen's rhythm. And once Cory, gets in rhythm at range, I think this fight is all downhill for Mario Bautista. So it's going to be interesting. I would obviously recommend as a game planner for Mario Bautista to wrestle a lot in this matchup. I don't think his wrestling is going to be as effective, against Cory as like a Merab's was, as an Umar's was. And I think that, even Umar Nurmagomedov really struggled to control Cory Sandhagen on the ground. He was really good at, fucking up his rhythm, but didn't control him much. And I think, Mario Bautista, if he can't really mess up Cory's rhythm, which I don't know if he has the wrestling to go ahead and do that, Cory Sandhagen is going to win this fight. So, I think Sandhagen gets this one done. I mean, like I said, I see a lot of people potentially chasing a plus money Mario Bautista. I get it. When I first looked at this matchup, honestly, I was leaning Mario Bautista. But the more I look at it, I just think that, Cory Sandhagen is going to be able to get this one done. I think his striking is way too clean. Like I said, he's way too good at range. He's way too good at, maintaining distance. He's going to be a little bit taller in this one as well. I think he defends the wrestling. I think he pieces up Mario Bautista. Mario's going to be gritty. He's going to be a tough out. And, honestly, Mario has power too. But at the end of the day, I think Cory gets it done. Let's move on to the next matchup. Moving on to the next matchup on the card, we got Brandon Royval versus Loner Kavanagh. And, this is the one that I see the sentiment around this fight kind of being a foregone conclusion that Loner Kavanagh is going to win. And I'm going to go ahead and pick Loner Kavanagh to beat Brandon Royval this weekend. That being said, though, I think this fight is going to be a lot closer. See, I don't think that, Brandon Royval honestly is super chinny. I know he's coming off a knockout loss to Manel Kape, but at the same time, Charles Johnson did put Loner Kavanagh to sleep as well. So I don't think Brandon Royval is, specifically chinny. I do think he is still fairly a durable fighter. Loner Kavanagh on the other side, though, I think is just going to be a little bit sharper. I think his defense is a little bit better on the feet. I don't see much grappling in this fight. And honestly, I know it's going to be a pretty simple comparison, but I do think this could look a lot closer to like the Joshua Van Brandon Royval fight. I know both Loner Kavanagh and Joshua Van have had kind of similar trajectories, both being knocked out by Charles Johnson, but also just being these really blue chip prospects within the division. We saw Joshua Van's fight against Brandon Royval, and with Loner Kavanagh, I don't necessarily think he has the volume of a Joshua Van, but at the same time, I think he does have great speed. I think he has great accuracy, and I think his defense is slightly better than a Royval. So I'm going to give this to the slightly more technical fighter, who I also still think puts up a great pace himself in Loner Kavanagh. I think that the grappling in this fight should cancel out if there is any, so I don't really see any threat there. I think it's going to be a 3-round banger. I do think it's going to be a little bit closer than people may seem. I don't think it's a foregone conclusion for Loner Kavanagh, but that being said, I do like Loner Kavanagh, and honestly, he does seem like a parlayable piece at the current price tag he's at. I haven't personally parlayed him in anything just yet, but I think Kavanagh gets it done. I'll look a little bit deeper into it if I want to make it, something I add to a parlay of mine for UFC 329. But I think Kavanagh gets it done just by being a little bit sharper, a little bit slicker on the feet throughout, all 3 rounds. But that being said, Royval is a dog. He's going to make this a dog fight. So, if Kavanagh doesn't show up, if, some of those cardio issues that were answered in the Moreno fight where he went 25 minutes, he did fight at altitude. Some of those issues were kind of addressed, but if those cardio issues start coming back for Kavanagh in this matchup, Royval could definitely pick it up because Royval does also, manage a really good pace inside fights. We saw him go toe-to-toe with Joshua Van at an extremely high pace. So, Royval's going to be game. Kavanagh's going to have his work cut out for him this weekend. That being said, I do think Kavanagh gets it done. Let's move on to the next matchup. Moving on to the next matchup on the card, we have the main card opener of King Green versus Terrance McKinney. And I'm going to go ahead and pick Terrance McKinney to win this one by an early finish. Now, Terrance McKinney honestly is not a fighter that I love picking from a sports betting perspective, not a fighter that I like to be on whatsoever. He's kind of only won in the first round. I think he has one win in his entire career. That's in the third round. But outside of that, if the fight makes it out of the first round, he normally loses. First round is kind of all his win equity, his entire share. Another interesting thing to note is that, this guy is 18-8. And in those fights, he's never once gone to a decision, win or lose. So this guy doesn't see the final bell. Normally, he's a very aggressive, very quick fighter, very skilled, one of the most dangerous people in the first round, one of the highest level lightweights in the first round. But outside of that, once things start going downhill for him, or uphill, I should say, he just doesn't come back into a fight. So Terrance McKinney's either going to go out there and look great or going to go out there and, look great for a bit, not get the finish, and then just fuck it up. So Terrance McKinney is who Terrance McKinney is. The only issue is I don't think King Green at this point in his career can handle the early storm from Terrance McKinney. Now, Terrance McKinney, obviously, like I said, is very untrustworthy, but, he's still got some, decent wins under his belt. And when he loses, I'm trying to think of the Esteban Rubic loss, for example, just a perfectly placed head kick. King Green is not really doing that. King Green with the hands down style, doesn't have crazy power on his own side. Obviously, he did catch, Daniel Zellhuber, put him out of there, but Zellhuber ended up being a pretty big fraud, especially from the type of prospect that people thought he was. So he puts Daniel Zellhuber out. Jeremy Stevens is so old at this point. Lance Gibson Jr., the split decision win. Honestly, not a terrible win. I think Lance Gibson Jr. is actually a fairly decent prospect, fairly bright prospect within the sport. So overall, I think that, King Green, while he has been on a little bit of an unk-ish run as of late, 3-fight win streak, this is a fight where, he's kind of going to put an end to the run. I think that Terrance McKinney gets him out of there early. If this fight extends, of course, then, King Green, I think live could look great. So, if McKinney kind of puts a beating on King Green early in this fight and then, doesn't put him away, look for a live spot on Bobby Green. You're already going to get him at underdog money pre-fight. So if he loses the first round, drops it, you're going to get him at an even bigger price tag. But at the same time, just be careful going in on it. But at the end of the day, Terrance McKinney, early finish, sub or KO, either or. Let's move on to the next matchup. All right, so moving on to the next matchup on the card, we have Robert Whittaker versus Nikita Krylov. So Robert Whittaker making his light heavyweight debut here. And, the narrative around this is pretty consistent. Robert Whittaker was once a welterweight, was a fairly small middleweight, and now moving up to light heavyweight, where he will have a real size disadvantage in this matchup. 6 foot to, Nikita Krylov's 6'3". There's also a 4-inch reach advantage for Nikita Krylov as well. That being said, though, I am going to pick Robert Whittaker to win here. Now, we saw Paulo Costa show his Letterman skill up from middleweight to light heavyweight against Azamat Murzakanov, who was absolutely just bullying people in the division. Now, Murzakanov honestly always had holes. He was this undefeated fighter getting finishes, but, you could see cardio holes in his game. You could see a little bit of quit in Murzakanov in prior fights. And, if he didn't land something huge, some of those prior fights could have gone a lot different for him. Paulo Costa goes in there, looks amazing against Murzakanov. Now we have Robert Whittaker moving up against Krylov. And honestly, I just think that Krylov's chin is kind of gone. And Whittaker, we saw what he did to, I think, Ikram Aliskerov. He's still going to be quick. He's going to definitely be quicker than Nikita Krylov. The footwork's going to be there for Robert Whittaker. Now, Krylov could just kind of overwhelm him, just kind of pressure him, just use his size to kind of push him up against the cage, use a lot of wrestling in this matchup as well, kind of like RDR-esque. And, clearly Whittaker did struggle with that. RDR beat him out on a very close split decision. That being said, though, it's just Krylov's durability. And I know it's kind of thick coming from someone picking Robert Whittaker because Whittaker's durability is obviously not in the best place either. But I just think that, Whittaker, these losses as of late, the RDR split decision one was extremely close. And just honestly a weird fight. RDR had a ton of momentum going into that. The Khamzat Chimaev face crank, weird fight there as well, but losing to Khamzat Chimaev is not the same as, fighting a Nikita Krylov. And then the knockout loss to Dricus du Plessis 2 years ago with 2 wins in the middle of a Paulo Costa and an Ikram Alaskarov. So, Paulo Costa looked great making this weight class jump. Not to say that means Robert Whittaker will as well, but I think that the Letterman skill is at play here. I think Whittaker does have a good shot of just being really light on the feet, being quicker, and I think his power should be good for someone like a Nikita Krylov who doesn't need to be hit with the craziest shot to go down. So I got Whittaker by knockout in this one. A little bit of a out there pick. I do think that these odds are pretty accurate. They're pretty tight. I think Whittaker was in the -200s earlier on, but he seems to be tightening up, and I think it makes sense. I mean, the size disadvantage does worry me. The new weight class does worry me. I don't even know if it's a perfect move for Whittaker to move up to light heavyweight. But that being said, I'm going to pick Whittaker by knockout. I don't think he's going to go on a crazy run at light heavyweight, but I think Nikita Krylov at this point in Krylov's career, this is a winnable matchup for Robert Whittaker. So give me Whittaker by knockout. Let's move on to the next matchup. All right, heading over to the next matchup on the card, we got Gable Stevenson making his UFC debut against Elisha, Ellison, and gonna keep this one really short. Gable Stevenson, massive favorite in the thousands, -2,500, something like that. He's gonna win this fight. This is a layup for him. He's John Jones's protege. We know not a lot about Gable Stevenson, but we have a lot of hype on Gable going into this matchup for his UFC debut. The one thing is, I guess, his opponent, Elisha Ellison, he's fighting with house money. He's got one loss in the UFC to Brando Perisic. I think Brando Perisic, honestly, as a heavyweight, has looked pretty okay, in my opinion. I know he's coming off a pretty decent win. Yeah, Shamil Gaziev win. He beats, obviously, the roided out Louis Sutherland. Elisha Ellison, he beats him in his UFC debut. So, this guy, Brando Perisic, is pretty decent. Elisha Ellison, coming into this, like I said, pure house money. If he pulls it off, he pulls it off. He's probably not going to pull it off. Never say never, I guess, especially in 2026 when it comes to the UFC. But Gable Stevenson gets this one done. Probably gets him out of there super early. Let's move on to the next matchup. All right, moving on to the next matchup on the card, we got Adrian Yanez versus Cody Garbrandt. And we see Cody Garbrandt finding himself in a spot where he's a 3-1 underdog here. As a former champion, that is interesting to look at. But at the end of the day, this line makes a ton of sense. Adrian Yanez is someone who I think is actually kind of putting things together at this point in his career. I think he had a decent layoff, if I'm not mistaken. About a year and a half, he kind of took off between, his fight against Daniel Marcos, where he lost by split decision. I thought that was a pretty clear win for Marcos, but honestly, I think Yanez is a super game fighter. He comes off that draw to Ricky Simon, where, look, I understand it's round-based scoring, but, if you watch that fight, Adrian Yanez beat up Ricky Simon. He won the fight against Ricky Simon. And, Ricky Simon is a tough wrestler to deal with. He's got great pressure. He's got great cardio. He's got strong wrestling. He's short. He's strong, low center of gravity. Ricky Simon is not an easy fighter to deal with. And, I thought Adrian Yanez dealt with him pretty nicely. They end up giving Ricky Simon rounds 1 and 2 and then making it a draw by giving Adrian Yanez a 10-8 in the third round. So, interestingly enough, a fight that I thought Yanez could potentially be up 3-0 in, he was going to lose until a pretty late kind of knockdown that was got Ricky Simon really wobbled, got him almost out of there. That kind of scored that round a 10-8. So, interesting to see that fight was actually going to go in Ricky Simon's favor. Adrian Yanez, I think, had an amazing performance. He won that fight, in my opinion. Like I said, had a really good third round. I thought the first couple rounds were close, but honestly, I would give them to Adrian Yanez. Going up against Cody Garbrandt here, Garbrandt just looks so terrible in that matchup against Zhao Long. His names are kind of backwards wherever you look, but against Zhao Long, I actually picked Cody Garbrandt as an underdog to win that fight, and watching that was honestly an absolute shit show. I mean, Cody Garbrandt ends up getting the win after 2-point deductions. He does win the first round off getting a knockdown, and honestly, even that first round, I think, is debatable. I think even after the 2-point deductions, it's interesting to see how that decision could have gone, in my opinion, when I was watching the fight at least. On the rewatch, I think, it's probably the right decision after the point deductions, but still an absolute shit show of a fight. Zhao Long was kind of piecing up Cody Garbrandt in the second and third rounds, definitely winning. Cody Garbrandt just wasn't doing anything. Even after the point deductions, he got angry. He acted like he was, really riled up, and then proceeded to throw absolutely nothing. Then proceeded to just kind of run the timer out in the third round to kind of go get his decision victory. Pretty, terrible performance from Cody Garbrandt, in my opinion. Do I think if, he's doing that with Zhao Long, he's going to come out here and do anything with Adrian Yanez? Absolutely not. I think Yanez is going to have a lot of success in this fight. I think Yanez knocks Cody Garbrandt out in this matchup. Maybe there's a world where it goes to a decision, but honestly, Yanez, like I said, has I think, been looking pretty good as of late, piecing some things together. And I always thought he was a fairly game fighter. So give me Adrian Yanez to win this one by knockout. The line is what it is, but honestly, he's someone that I personally have in some parlays this week. And I think that, should be safe to parlay for this card. Let's move on to the next matchup. All right, moving on to the next matchup on the card, we have Kamaka III versus Luke Riley. Kamaka is on his second stint inside the UFC. He didn't have a great time the first time around, lost to some, fairly low level and honestly not UFC caliber fighters, but he did do decent in Bellator, in PFL, had some okay comp outside the UFC, but honestly, we've kind of known by now, comp outside the UFC just isn't what it is. We have fighters like Patchy Mix, regarded as one of, the best on the planet, but look what he did inside the UFC. So can't really trust the competition outside the UFC. That being said, Kamaka is kind of like a, trusty veteran. He's going to be strong. He's going to be gritty. And, he's going to kind of go for it out there. He's going to be hard to put away. But Luke Riley, 13-0, undefeated, prospect, fast ass hands, very accurate, got some real power on him as well. Looked great in his debut. Knows people are gonna try to take him down. Kamaka honestly is, primarily a wrestler. He does strike a lot, but primarily Kamaka is a wrestler. He is a wrestle first type of fighter if you go watch his tape. So Kamaka is gonna try to take Luke Riley down. Luke Riley, he knows people want to take him to the ground. He knows people don't really want to strike with him. And if they do, it's going to be like a mix of, grappling and striking. So Kamaka, could be a crafty vet, could try to kind of put together that exact game plan of mixing in takedowns, striking a lot with Luke Riley. But honestly, I just don't think it'll be enough. I think Luke Riley is going to be too sharp at 27 years old, someone who actually, is just really talented, someone the UFC is trying to build up. I don't think Kamaka is, super tall task for someone like Luke Riley. So I think Luke Riley, with the fast and accurate hands, does eventually find like maybe a late knockout on this one. Kamaka is, pretty tough. He is a veteran. He is someone that will go out on his shield. So maybe he kind of lasts all 3 rounds in this matchup. But I think that Luke Riley will find a KO late in this fight. Let's move on to the next matchup. All right, moving on to the next matchup on the card, we got Tracy Cortez versus Wang. And I'm going to go ahead and pick the underdog here. Give me Tracy Cortez to get this one done against Wang. I think the line is, probably right where it should be. I honestly would just have it flipped with Cortez being a slight favorite here. I think she's just a more well-rounded mixed martial artist. I mean, she has all the advantages on the ground in this matchup. I think she definitely will take this fight to the ground. I don't think Wang is, this world beater. I know she had a pretty big hype coming into the UFC. She also had a big knockout in her debut. But overall, I think the Wang lines have been, fairly inflated. I think she's good. I don't think she's great. I think Tracy Cortez is much more proven, much more tested, has a way better resume, has fought the way harder opponents. She's, like I said, more well-rounded. She's going to have the ground game to go to here. I think her boxing is improving from fight to fight. She's getting fairly crisp with it. She's coming off a loss, I believe, to Erin Blanchfield. And, interesting loss here. I think she did pick up the first round. She goes and gets submitted out there in the second round. But if I do remember correctly, Tracy Cortez won the first round in that matchup by, defending some of the grappling from Erin Blanchfield. So I think Cortez is a decent boxer. If she mixes things up well here, it's going to be trouble for Wang. I think that, Wang will be a step behind. Like I said, Cortez is, a very seasoned fighter in this division. She's going to have, all the advantages when it comes to experience. She's coming off, a fight to Erin Blanchfield and Viviane Araujo, Rose Namajunas, Jasmine Jasudavicius. So she's fighting some real comp. And then you look at, Wang, obviously not fighting anywhere near that level of competition. So I think that Tracy Cortez is going to be a big jump up. I think she's going to mix things up really well. I think her boxing will kind of open up because of the wrestling, because of the grappling. I think that, the grappling, honestly, at the end of the day, will be successful against Wang. So give me Cortez to get this one done. Will there be a finish? I'm not too sure. I mean, we saw Wang get submitted by Gabriela Fernandez as a massive favorite back in 2024. So maybe there is a finish somewhere lined up in this fight, but I can also see it going to a hard-fought decision. I'm going to go with Tracy Cortez to get it done. Let's move on to the next matchup. All right, moving on up the card, we have Damian Pinas versus Cesar Almeida. I'm going to try to not laugh every time I say his name, but, I guess I am a little bit immature. But Damian Pinas, 9-1, pretty, I guess, like, good-looking record. He has some hype. He's got, real power, very explosive, very athletic. And, that's going to matter in this fight against Cesar Almeida. Now, Damian is a 2-1 favorite going into this matchup. And I'm going to pick Cesar Almeida, the 2-1 underdog, to get this one done against Damian. Now, Cesar Almeida has had an extensive kickboxing career. He's only 7-2 inside, MMA, professional MMA, but I wouldn't look at that record and think he's inexperienced. I actually think he's got some real good reps inside the octagon. He has a split decision loss to Roman Kopylov, where, Kopylov, who's a fairly seasoned striker in his own right, had to go to the wrestling in that matchup. If you don't mix in a bunch of takedowns, a bunch of grappling, you're not going to have a great time with Cesar Almeida, who has a very layered striking approach, a very, technical striking approach. He's got power, he's got patience, he will pick his shots, and he's got a ton of experience when it comes to standing up and kickboxing with people. And Damian, on the other hand, I think is very young, very athletic, very explosive, and I could look really dumb here. And in the first 2.5 minutes of this fight, Cesar Almeida could just get nuked. And honestly, that is a very real possibility. But do I want to price that possibility at 2-1? I don't think so. I think majority of the win equity for Damian is in that first 3.5 minutes, 2.5 minutes. I don't know, wherever there is, tons of explosiveness. He's got tons of power. He can really just impose his will, impose his athleticism onto the fight. But I think if Cesar Almeida stays, sticks through that storm, which, well, he can be hurt. He's not insanely chinny where I think that, there's no chance he sticks through that storm. I think this fight can kind of look very different. I think there's probably a world in this fight where Damian's just out of his depth, too inexperienced, too young, and Cesar Almeida looks like he's just on another level on the feet. So I think that, Damian probably picks up round 1 here. It's probably fairly aggressive, but if Almeida can kind of survive that early storm, I see him picking up rounds 2 and 3, potentially even finding a late knockout in this matchup. So give me the 2-1 underdog and Cesar Almeida to get it done. Let's move on to the next matchup. Moving on to the next matchup on the card, we got Farid Basharat with a short notice replacement opponent in John Garza. And, Farid Basharat, massive favorite, especially with the short notice replacement. He was initially scheduled to be fighting Ethan Ewing. Very, very tough opponent. The line was pretty close. I mean, Basharat's 15-0, undefeated, but I thought Ewing would get the better of him in that matchup. Now he's going up against John Garza. This kid is being called up to a pretty tall task, making his UFC debut against Farid Basharat. He's another fighter here, like Elisha Ellison, that's just kind of playing with house money, and I don't expect him to win. I do expect Farid Basharat, one of American top team's best, to go out there and do what he does. Now, Basharat, the one thing about Basharat is he's not dangerous whatsoever. Basharat is a pure decision merchant, right? What is the finishes Basharat's getting in the UFC? He got a finish 2 years, 10 months ago to Clayton Rodriguez, who's just, not UFC caliber. The win to Taylor Lapilus actually is a really solid win. Taylor Lapilus is one of those fighters, if you forgot, he's doing pretty good inside the UFC, randomly just had some contract problems, ends up not renewing, even though he was actually doing really well inside the promotion. So the Taylor Lapilus win for Basharat, I think, actually is pretty good. Obviously, he is the better Basharat, bro. Javid now has just been kind of fraud checked a couple times. But, John Garza, very tall task here. The wrestling from Basharat, just in general, Basharat's just really good at maintaining distance, maintaining range. This kid is 23 years old, going up against, a 28-year-old kind of veteran, just someone who's kind of in their prime, really kind of getting their stride inside the promotion as well. Really tough task for John Garza. Is this an Ethan Ewing, Malcolm Wellmaker situation? I don't think so. I think, Wellmaker in his own right was still fairly inexperienced, but a Basharat in this matchup is going to be, extremely experienced. So, he's minus 600. If you want to add him into some parlays, be my guest. Pretty tough, pretty deep price tag to kind of add to parlays. Won't really do much, but at the end of the day, 6 out of 10 times for sure, Farid Basharat wins this fight. I think just in general, 10 out of 10 times, Basharat probably wins this fight at this current state of, Garza's career. But Garza's tough from what I see. He's got some power as well. So maybe, he can kind of build into this UFC career from here. I think he definitely does have potential from the tape I saw, but Basharat's going to win this one. Let's move on to the next matchup. All right, moving on to the next matchup on the card. This is one I feel very strongly about. We have Ryan Gandra versus Zachary Reese, and I'm going to keep it a buck. I'm going to be honest with you. Zachary Reese is fucking ass. And, I don't even care if I get this one wrong or not. There is 0% chance in the world that I would tell anyone that I would pick or predict Zachary Reese to go in and win a fight. Now, this guy has some pretty solid physical tools. I mean, he has a great frame. And I think, he does have potential, except he is just a terrible fighter. He's got no game plan, no fight IQ, no grit, just doesn't know what the fuck he's doing. He's just kind of a bum, in my opinion. Now, Zach Reese, I've bet on Zach Reese in the past. I've won my bet on Zach Reese in the past. He's won fights where I've bet on him. And after the fight, I just look and I'm like, what the hell? This guy is an absolute bum. how could I ever bet on this guy? And I'll probably never do it again. And then I find out, he's fighting Dusko Todorovic. I'm like, oh, you know what? Maybe, he should do really well against Dusko, right? Bet on him against Dusko. I mean, he does get the win, but once again, I'm like, bro, what the hell? This guy is an absolute bum. Now, Ryan Gander, on the other hand, he's kind of unproven. I mean, 9-1. He's kind of nuking people early, so unproven guy in Ryan Gandra. There's not like too much to kind of like go off of when it comes to him. I think he's got, good pocket boxing. He's really good in close range. And I think, honestly, that's something Zachary struggles with. Zachary does his best work with kicks at range. He's coming off an absolutely abysmal performance, split decision loss against Michel Pereira where nothing really fucking happened. Beats a Jackson McVeigh. I don't care about that. Loses to Asmat Bakoyev, who kind of, got fraud checked in his own right. Bakoyev, massive favorite in his last fight, I think minus 500. Goes out there and loses to Tresean Gore. I mean, Tresean Gore honestly did look good in that fight. I don't want to take a lot away from Tresean Gore. He actually did look pretty good. But that being said, Bakoyev goes out there and nukes Zachary Reese. I think this is going to be very similar. I think Ryan Gander goes out there and just nukes Reese. I think Reese gets really lost in there. I don't know what the hell's going on in his mind, but I don't think he thinks a lot inside the octagon. And I think, Ryan Gander is going to make you, hit you with something that lets you, think even less. So give me Ryan Gander to go out there and nuke him. Look, if Zachary Reese somehow keeps Gandra at range, kicks him up, moves, blah, 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 I'll be pretty impressed. Maybe I'll give him another chance. But at the moment, until Zachary shows me anything that he's somewhat a competent person, not even just a competent fighter, but a competent person, I'm not going to ever talk about picking him. So give me Ryan Gander to win this one. Maybe after that breakdown, you think I'm a little bit biased. Maybe don't take this one into consideration if you want to based on that. But I think Ryan Gander goes out there and just nukes Zachary Reese like Bakoyev did. Let's move on to the next matchup. All right, well, congratulations if you guys made it this far. We're on the very first fight of the early prelims. You are officially ultra hardcore UFC fan. We got Cody Durden versus Alessandro Costa, and I'm going to go ahead and pick Alessandro Costa, who is a minus 250-ish favorite going into this matchup against Cody Durden. Now, honestly, I don't trust Alessandro Costa at minus 250. There was a point in time where I was really high on him. I bet a big chunk on him to beat Kevin Borjas at around minus 130. He ends up going out there and actually looking really good against Kevin Borjas. So then, I kind of doubled down. I had him in a ton of parlays at minus 350 against Alden Correa. Obviously, Alden Correa has looked amazing inside the UFC. Alessandro Costa looked, pretty lost in there. I know he had a weird injury throughout that fight as well. But, that fight just kind of really left a sour taste in my mouth when it comes to, picking or even betting on Alessandro Costa. But I do think he should win this fight against Cody Durden. Now, Cody Durden is a pretty volatile, fighter. He had a pretty good performance last time out against Rafael Filo as a big underdog, which is also why I think that, a lot of people think Durden might be live in this matchup. And honestly, Durden might be live. I mean, his loss to Joshua Van, for example, right? Takes the first round off of Joshua Van, survives all three. Goes into round two, needing 1 out of the 2 or 3 rounds. Obviously, he did just ultra gas himself out by going all out on takedowns in that first round against Joshua Van. Something to keep in mind. But, still took a round off him. Jose Ochoa is a tricky fighter, man. Jose Ochoa knocks him out. Alan Nascimento, tricky fighter as well. Niam Dragal Tumendembrel. Now, he's kind of a berserker, pretty unproven. Don't really know an insane amount about him. I know, he did, I think, lose his UFC debut, if I am not mistaken, comes back, beats Cody Durden. Now, Alessandro Costa, who, like I said, I think he's pretty good. I just don't know if I trust him at these odds. I will pick him to win this matchup against Cody Durden, though. Durden could be pretty volatile. He could come out, look pretty good. But Durden gets hurt in there. Alessandro Costa has, some good power. He's pretty accurate. He's got a great overhand as well. I think he gets Durden in some trouble. I think he finds, a maybe second round, early first round knockout. That is my prediction for this fight. I do think it's Alessandro Costa by knockout. Thank you guys so much for tuning into the very first video on the Octagon Labs channel. It really does mean a lot to me. Like I said early in the video, this channel is not only going to be picks, predictions, and sports betting. I would love to share my MMA takes with everyone, my UFC takes with everyone, what's happening within the promotion, upcoming things, maybe some controversial things, kind of give you guys my opinion on it. I like to think of myself as a fairly objective and unbiased MMA fan, so curious to see what other people will think of that as well. Like I said, it means a lot to me for you guys tuning in to this very first video. Stay tuned for more content on this channel. Hopefully, I'll see you guys very soon, and good luck to everyone on their bets for UFC 329.